Hello everyone, it's Mike Levin. On Sunday, January 31st, 2021, and the snow has begun coming down here, but I figure I'll start shooting my video even as I get on my way here to my little trip that I'm making, a little but very important trip. Key to replace my daughter's Nintendo Switch hardware, Switch Lite, one Switch Lite for another. And so, the discussion for today, in staying consistent with the theme, is switching hardware. Switching hardware is hard to do, and perhaps even a more general discussion of platforms, which I do from time to time because the term platform is thrown around so all-encompassingly, and really perhaps the most descriptive thing is hardware, a particular instance of the hardware that exists at some point in time and space, like this iPhone XS Max I'm shooting this video on, because hardware is a fleeting thing. It's a artistic creation. It's an assemblage of matter into a unit that's going to exist that way for a certain amount of time and then poof, go away, while variations on its design, its template, are going to continue to get created. New ones spun out, new ones coming into existence and being in people's lives, such as it is, until they themselves poof and go away and the cycle gets repeated. Phones don't have babies, they're not self-replicating. Nonetheless, a evolutionary process, much like life, is going on with our hardware platforms. And everyone is in its own way unique, is in fact unique. It's made from atoms that no other phone of its kind are made from. It's got a serial number that no other phone has, unless it's spoofed, of course, but these are, hacks. And we're not talking about hacks because things that live at the edge of the way things usually are always exist, and they're outliers and they're exceptions, and they shouldn't really excessively color the initial discussion where you flesh things out in broad strokes according to the 80-20 rule, so you got a real rough fundamental understanding of how everything works, and then you can accept the fact that there are variations and have your code gracefully handle accordingly with try, accept, finalies, that kind of thing. So it always becomes a discussion of language, doesn't it? This keeps switching over to the language discussion. It is very closely related to the platform discussion, because in order to use a platform, which is generally a particular instance of hardware you happen to have, you get familiar with the language that it induces you to use to interact with it. You might also say it's an application program interface, an API. APIs imply also a language. The syntax and structure and symbols and all the rest of it that gets fed in through some sort of interface and gets returned out from some sort of interface are themselves statements written in language. So the discussion of switching between hardware platforms often has to do with breaking a relationship you have with a particular piece of hardware, because you are communicating with it, you are in communion with it. You have a language, you know what gestures and symbols to invoke to have certain experiences, and it gives you your neurological response, your neurotransmitters. It releases certain chemicals in your body, such as serotonin, the hearth and home hormone that makes you feel everything is good and fine and okay. And a lot of people are getting that from Animal Crossing these days, and it's tied to that particular piece of hardware in a way that game developers are still determined to make true the reality. Now, the actual reality is that information is information, and it can flow freely between sufficiently similar hardware to recreate the experience you are having. The promise of the cloud, hardware doesn't matter. Now, the even truer reality, the reality of the situation, the other reality of the situation is that you're not going to get to that information without hardware. That information only comes to life and takes form by being transmitted to live upon some hardware substrate, and the magical invocations made to load that information into memory in such a way that, you know, all the machine instructions get carried out, so it creates a sufficiently convincing experience to the user that it is, you know, that same piece of hardware they used the last time they played that game. They're on their same island, yada yada. So it turns out that recently, so Animal Crossing at the time of me shooting this video is up to version, I think it's 1.7.0, and it was just on 1.6.0. And I believe by the time it reached 1.4.0, when you started up Animal Crossing, if you hit the minus key on the title screen, Tom Nook would appear and start offering you the process of backing up your island, presumably into the cloud using your Nintendo account. And the way my kid's Switch broke, the minus key isn't working. So he can't use the built-in default island backup and restore feature. Luckily, Nintendo also distributed an app, a standalone app, to do this from not within Animal Crossing, but the Island Mover. And it turns out you have to have your other piece of hardware ready, and the clever way that Nintendo has designed to do this is you set up your other Nintendo, and you run Animal Crossing, you run the app on it, you put it into receive mode, and you put your broken, presumably you can do this on a broken Switch, I guess it's a tool that's used in repair shops a lot. You put your broken Switch into transmit mode, and you can transmit your island over to another hardware platform. And because Switches and Switch Lites are so nearly identical in hardware, they don't even need all that virtualization platform stuff that I talked about before, because the ecosystem, the manufacturer has such tight control over it all that you don't have to thunk down layers for interoperable performance. When manufacturers keep a tight fist over the software that runs on their hardware, they can avoid having to have the same traditionally performance thunking, meaning reducing of performance, but more recently not so performance thunking virtualization layers. That is a little bit misleading. It makes you think that it's doing software emulation, where the machine instruction set of one machine is being translated to the machine instruction set of another machine, which is how QEMU and other true emulators work, and it's where all the performance is lost, extra cycles being burned in translation. But these days, virtualization generally means just memory management and containerization technology of processing space and of memory space and of hard drive space, so that your virtualized computer doesn't step on the next virtualized computer over that's running on the exact same hardware. And you're like, well, that sounds fragile and everything. Well, it is, and the industry has rallied around making it less fragile. And oftentimes a way of doing that is dedicated processors, because there's multi-core systems so often these days, when, you know, a standard i7 Intel processor will have 4 cores in it. Each one of those cores can become a, quote, standalone virtualized computer. So these tricks don't have to happen so much on proprietary game platforms like the Nintendo Switch. However, that is sort of a digression in the discussion. The discussion is about one's love for hardware and the pain that exists in switching. So when it's a proprietary platform and they have the power to enforce, profitability rules, like you buy Animal Crossing once, it can only run on the piece of hardware you bought it on, that's going to propose a little dilemma. I think I'm going to have to re-download Animal Crossing on the new Switch hardware and then have it running simultaneously with the same software on two Switches, and it creates some ambiguity. So these software enforcement rules on instantiating new instances of your software can be controlled and influenced by the people who control the platform. It's not always as straightforward as one might hope and think, as anyone who tried to emulate an iPhone on their desktop has learned. Talk about tight ecosystem control. Apple is the master of it, to the point where it's illegal, according to their license agreements, to run virtualized instances of Mac operating systems. And that's a problem, because people who are coding their software in a way that it's like in one containerized instantiatable instance under common hardware out there, targeting common virtual machine layers, such as the kind of work I do, you just assume that your free and open sourced licenses are just going to allow you to scale out to thousands of instances. As long as you stick to, say, the right licenses of the components you're using, you are unencumbered when you scale. Not so when you really hardwire your applications to require, say, Macs underneath of it, or iOS devices. And you would never create something that, had some sort of scaling and perhaps swarming behavior to it, with it being based on anything Apple, because of the license problems. These are part of the reasons why Microsoft has included Linux, the Linux boot kernel, the Ubuntu Linux boot kernel derived from Debian Linux, in with Windows 10 now, because they know when the developers create things, they're just automatically going to go to things with the best license arrangements and stability and performance. There's a set of criteria, but given that tools in the free and open source world are going to satisfy that criteria, I would dare say all developers would rather take up the free and open source tools today and have all the money go into their pocket, have all the control be in their realm, or optionally in the realm of companies who support the free and open source software, like Anaconda has gone. There's all kinds of models possible when you're in the FO, free and open source software, the FOSS model. There's even looser models out there, truly free software. There had been splits in that community in the early days when the free and open source software concept was being created. There's still splits today between, say, the GNU 2 and the GNU 3 license, the main free and open source licenses that govern the Linux kernel and operating system out there. GNU 2 does, not allow proprietary companies to sort of take the baby and run with it, raise it as their own, and never give back to the free and open source community. Whereas the GNU 3 library insists that if you're making money off of free and open source code, you have to give back your customizations. And there have been big incidents, most notably with Linksys, the now part of Cisco, but back in those days it was its own company, Linksys, and the WRT router, which is today Open WRT, which is also under the same foundation as Debian Linux. So you can see there's a spirit here that is in the public interest. It's hard to really quantify what it is about the software that I'm encouraging you to lean towards using. And I do believe that it's stuff that's in the public interest. That's the name of the nonprofit organization that was created. I said foundation, but I think it's an NPO that was created for Debian so that they could raise the kind of money that's required to keep it churning along. So many things really deeply rely on Debian Linux today, especially now that Microsoft uses Ubuntu, which is based on Debian. So the big players are going to keep all this stuff out there and in common use. So it's a safe harbor. You can take up software development using things under these general licenses, knowing that it's time tested, it's stable, it's versions of this stuff that won, and it's got the big boys behind it and big girls behind it in ways that are quite difficult to undermine. And that's been the source of a number of my videos lately, because no matter how much something looks and feels like the inextricable pea in the pool of tech, like Java and MySQL, you see that when one of the feared juggernaut profit-driven vendors like Oracle gobbles you up, as it did Sun Microsystems when it got Java, and as it did MySQL, and as it did, few will remember, years before when it got Berkeley DB. So it killed the NoSQL industry before it was being born, as the NPM built into Unix database was being extracted into a highly capable key value pair free and open source database. Snatch, Oracle gobbled that up too. It's so Berkeley DB is now commercial, and it had to wait until things like MongoDB and Redis came along before CouchDB. There's a number of them before this stuff became mainstream again. But the big industry vendors really have the ability to put the kibosh on this stuff, no matter how much you think it's formal and established and inextricable parts of the free and open source world. And so it's with a certain amount of fear that one learns that Microsoft has hired the creator of Python, Guido van Rossum, has bought the center of the free and open source software community, GitHub, and is now shipping the heart and soul of the Linux operating system, the boot kernel, with Windows. Of the four things that I tell you are your route to technological freedom, Linux, Python, Vim, and Git, Microsoft has gobbled 3 of them up, at least insofar as they can in today's world. They can't really gobble up Git, so they got GitHub. What are they going to do now with the text editor situation? Well, we see VS Code. They're going to put a astounding push behind redefining the expectations of the text editor, making it seem free and open source to get that check mark, making it open platform technology, the Google Electron platform, the components that are used to build the web browser are what builds the user interface, so it's essentially a web app without kooky UI stuff. So you got that check mark, free and open source, open UI for portability and durability over time, because a web platform will always be a sub-platform of other hardware. So you just recompile Electron for those platforms, and bam, you got yourself your user interface for VS Code on unknown platforms of the future. And speaking of unknown platforms of the future, we see one taking hold very firmly today in the form of 64-bit ARM, which is in new Microsoft computers like the Surface Pro X. There was a 32-bit one as the first version, but now it's 64-bit, and it's coming to have all the performance characteristics of a modern 64-bit Intel x86 processor, but very little of the power consumption properties. So it's the same as what Apple did with the M1 processor on their side with 64-bit ARM. So on both the Windows and the Macintosh side, there is a large attack on having to use these hot running, inefficient Intel processors. And what's assumed as P in the pool of tech, inextricable stuff, is readily extricated because virtualization layers, because, machine instructions that everyone can rally around, regardless of whether or not it's the native machine instructions of that platform. So the rest of it is how to poke a hole through whatever hardware you want to be on, whatever platform, the hardware platform discussion. That's a whole video right there. I'll forego it because I'm getting close to my destination. Hardware is the more real thing. Platform is an amorphous mix of labels and concepts in the mind that combines hardware, software, operating system, and the network it's running on, and the users who are on that network into one big thing called platform. Hardware and platforms very much represent snapshots in time. They're exciting. It's where all the action is. They can make you rich in a very short time frame as you put out software in those marketplaces. And that software tends to be of the high performance, optimized for the platform kinds, like mobile apps written in the native language for that mobile platform, Java for Android, Visual C, not Visual C, it's Objective-C or Swift for iOS, and then of course native C++ for a lot of platforms to get that sort of tweaked out performance. However, if you target stuff that targets virtual machines, as Java does with its JVM that popularized it, but which almost everything does, you get that same portability of your software between systems. However, you're not going to get that operating system native polish, and you're not going to be in the billionaire lottery of the Apple Web Store. But you'll very competently have work to do for the rest of your life, because everyone needs that kind of work. To be able to just sit down at almost any situation and step in at the API levels that all machines speak, Linux/Unix commands, the systems that get it started, which use usually init.d or systemd, you can grab the reins of almost anything and sort of wrangle it to do your bidding, because you don't rely on the visual levels. So Microsoft comes in, they start making you rely on these visual levels, and that's the beginning of the path of staying stuck to a vendor's platform with VS Code. That's their big in on the side of Microsoft. But on the side of Google is all the tools of the cloud platform, which are amazing and staggering and very cool, and will have you completely platform dependent within your first project or two. So, language literacy. How did this video even start? Where was I going? I know it had to do with modern literacy, thinking in a certain form of expressiveness that can't be taken away from you, holding captive. It's like having a portion of your brain belonging to someone else when your knowledge and know-how is sort of tied to a particular hardware platform, a proprietary hardware platform, and it becomes hard to switch. Oh yeah, this was a pain of switching. I'm on my way to get my daughter a new Nintendo Switch piece of hardware using the Nintendo app to move your island around. The information is the thing. Information is what breathes the heart and soul into a machine. The machine is factory produced, for the most part identical to thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of other identical pieces of hardware like it. Those pieces of hardware, so long as it's not license encumbered, can be instantiated again as virtual systems underneath future hardware. Turing complete, all this, ASM assembly, machine language level stuff, assures the interoperability of almost everything in almost all conditions, unless the excessive license encumberment, such as with Apple stuff, prevents it. So you're pretty safe with almost any platform you take up. However, you can take up platforms that don't have this uniquely time-dated, rapid, perishable date on it, like modern game platforms. and instead take up the stuff that's sort of lurking behind all the time. But that's not appropriate for my daughter switching her game platforms. But I do consider this, what I'm doing today, as an important introduction to the way things are, how information is what counts, how it can be carried around with you, greatly on you and inside of you, and how when hardware opportunities come up here and there around you over life, you can rapidly and hopefully easily instantiate those old-timey things that you used to know and have those nostalgic blasts from the past, as the retro computing, movement very much feels these days, split between the collecting of original hardware, which has some value, and the virtualized, simulation of this stuff on things such as your existing computer, or neat little devices built out of Raspberry Pis and other tiny embeddable computer systems and such. So that's my video. Don't fall too much in love with the hardware. You can always put stickers on something new you bought. Always back up, always know how to make your information flow around, know that the importance resides in the information, and that the importance really resides inside of you, because the information only takes meaning when it becomes internalized as a part of you. And as such, the tools you use are very important, because you don't want to have to always be retraining yourself, refiguring out the language of different hardwares and proprietary platforms. You generally want to be able to walk up and be happy and productive in almost any situation you walk into. And keep your heart from being broken a lot when you're not too attached to particular instances of hardware. So that's today. Here I am. I got a few things I need to do at the shopping center, so I'll wrap up there. I'll thank you for joining me and say hope to see you again soon, and don't forget to subscribe.